Right, starting with the book, The Cultural Politic of Emotions. And this book was written in, what is this? Yeah, wait, 2004, but the second edition came out in 2014, and I'm reading from the second edition, and this happens to be the first part, which is your introduction. All right, so introduction. Feel your way. Every day of every year, swarms of illegal immigrants and bogus asylum seekers invade Britain by any means available to them. Why? They are only seeking the easy comforts and free benefits in soft touch Britain, all funded by you, the British taxpayer. Supposedly a quote from the British National Front poster. Okay. How does a nation come to be imagined as having a soft touch? How does this having become a form of being or a national attribute? In the cultural politics of emotion, I explore how emotions work to shape the surfaces of individual and collective bodies. Bodies take the shape of the very contact they have with objects and others. My analysis proceeds by reading texts that circulate in the public domain, which work by aligning subjects with collectives by attributing others as the source of our feelings. In this quote from the British National Front, the others, who are named as illegal immigrants and bogus asylum seekers, threaten to overwhelm and swamp the nation. This is, of course, a familiar narrative, and like all familiar narratives, it deserves close and careful reading. The narrative works through othering the illegal immigrants, and bogus asylum seekers are those who are not us and who, in not being us, endanger what is ours. Right, so such others threaten to take away from what you have as the legitimate subject of the nation, as the one who is the true recipient of national benefits. The narrative invites the reader to adopt the you through working on emotions. Becoming this you would mean developing a certain rage against these illegitimate others who are represented as swarms in the nation. Indeed, to feel love for the nation, whereby love is an investment that should be returned. You are the taxpayer, is also to feel injured by these others who are taking what is yours. It is not the case, however, that anybody within the nation could inhabit this you. These short sentences depend on longer histories of articulation, which secure the white subject as sovereign in the nation at the same time as they generate effects in the alignment of you with the national body. In other words, the you implicitly evokes a we, a group of subjects who can identify themselves with the injured nation in this performance of personal injury. Within the British National Front, the we of the nation is only available to white Aryans. We will reinstate the values of separatism to our racial kindred. We will teach the youth that one's country is the family, the past, the sacred race itself. We live in a nation that is historically Aryan. This alignment of family, history, and race is powerful and works to transform whiteness into a familial tie, into a form of racial kindred that recognizes all non white others as strangers, as bodies out of place. The narrative is addressed to white Aryans and equates the vulnerability of the white nation with the vulnerability of the white body. You will not be soft, or will you? What is so interesting in this narrative is how soft touch becomes a national character. This attribution is not specific to fascist discourses. In broader public debates about asylum in the UK, one of the most common narratives is that Britain is a soft touch. Others try and get into the nation because they can have a life with easy comforts. The British government has transformed the narrative of the soft touch into an imperative. It has justified the tightening of asylum policies on the grounds that Britain will not be a soft touch. Indeed, the metaphor of soft touch suggests that the nation's borders and defenses are like skin. They are soft, weak, porous, and easily shaped, or even bruised by the proximity of others. It suggests that the nation is made vulnerable to abuse by its very openness to others. The soft nation is too emotional, too easily moved by the demands of others, and too easily seduced into assuming that claims for asylum as testimonies of injury are narratives of truth. To be a soft touch nation is to be taken in by the bogus. To take in is to be taken in. The demand is that the nation should seal itself from others if it is to act on behalf of its citizens rather than react to the claims of immigrants and other others. The implicit demand is for a nation that is less emotional, less open, less easily moved, one that is hard or tough. The use of metaphors of softness and hardness shows us how emotions become attributes of collectives which get constructed as being through feeling. Such attributes are, of course, gendered. The soft national body is a feminized body which is penetrated or invaded by others. It is significant that the word passion and the word passive share the same root in the Latin word for suffering. Passio. To be passive is to be enacted upon, as a negation that is already felt as suffering. The fear of passivity is tied to the fear of emotionality, in which weakness is defined in terms of a tendency to be shaped by others. Softness is narrated as a proneness to. Hold on. Proneness to injury. The association between passion and passivity is instructive. It works as a reminder of how emotion has been viewed as beneath the faculties of thought and reason. To be emotional is to have one's judgment affected. It is to be reactive rather than active, dependent rather than autonomous. Feminist philosophers have shown us how the subordination of emotions also works to subordinate the feminine and the body. Emotions are associated with women who are represented as closer to nature, ruled by appetite, and less able to transcend the body through thought, will, and judgment. All right, but still, I think you can add a little bit of the perspective from what is this? I forgot the name of that thing. Wait, uh, hold on, just DSM thing, I think. The DSM, right? Yeah, DSM. You can add the opinions of the DSM. I mean, what it has to say about you having emotions at all, or as a gendered person, as a gendered being. So I think, with regards to what was that, the Second World War, I think the attribution of hysteria to men who were coming out of the war with PTSD, I think that could also be included here if you are going into that. Right, we'll see. We can see from this language that evolutionary thinking has been crucial to how emotions are understood. Emotions get narrated as a sign of our prehistory and as a sign of how the primitive persists in the present. The Darwinian model of emotions suggests that emotions are not only beneath but behind the man or human, as a sign of an earlier and more primitive time. So there's a temporality attached to this pathologization. As Darwin puts it, with mankind, some expressions, such as the bristling of the hair under the influence of extreme terror, or the uncovering of the teeth under that of furious rage, can hardly be understood except on the belief that man once existed in a much lower and animal like condition. Right. Such an evolutionary model allows us to return to the risk of emotions posited through the attribution of soft touch as a national characteristic. The risk of being a soft touch for the nation and for the national subject is not only the risk of becoming feminine, but also of becoming less white by allowing those who are recognized as racially other to penetrate the surface of the body within such a narrative. Becoming less white would involve moving backwards in time such that one would come to resemble a more primitive form of life of social life or a lower and animal like condition. The hierarchy between emotion and thought or reason gets displaced, of course, into a hierarchy between emotions. Some emotions are elevated as signs of cultivation, whilst others remain lower as signs of weakness. The story of evolution is narrated not only as the story of the triumph of reason, but of the ability to control emotions and to experience the appropriate emotions at different times and places. Within contemporary culture, emotions may even be represented as good or better than thought, but only insofar as they are represented as a form of intelligence, as tools that can be used by subjects in the project of life and career enhancement. Alrighty. So I think in this case, um, when you are talking about emotions being used for career enhancement, the first thing that comes to mind is you have this quotient of a productivity, emotional productivity attached to this now. That brings us to the topic of emotional intelligence, emotional quotient, right? Um, how you're supposed to have more emotional quotient in order to bring your opponent down, in order to let your opponent, just bring bring down their guard or something, let down their guard and be more vulnerable to attack or something like that, or be more vulnerable to manipulation, that sort of a thing. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, emotion for career enhancement. I don't know, maybe you could attribute it to no, no, not attribute. I mean, you could look into the work of Halberstam when they talk about productive failure. How people with no emotional intelligence, or people who, I mean, let us say, intentionally deviate from emotional intelligence, from the common notions of emotional intelligence, intentionally is the emphasis here, to create productive failure, right? You could look into that as well. Right, so back to the text. If good emotions are cultivated and are worked on and towards, then they remain defined against uncultivated or unruly emotions, which frustrate the formation of the competent self. Those who are other, okay, those who are other to me or us, or those that threaten to make us other, remain the source of bad feeling in this model of emotional intelligence. It's not difficult to see how emotions are bound up with the securing of social hierarchy. Emotions become attributes of bodies as a way of transforming what is lower or higher into bodily traits. So at the same time, we also have like attributes of what are considered to be positive emotions and what are considered to be negative emotions, in the sense that which is more amenable to capitalist manipulation, which is more amenable to capitalist, or let us say neoliberal logics, logics that want to, let us say, exploit you, exploit your time, exploit your labor, exploit your attention, exploit even the way you surveil yourself, right? Because we have all these kinds of capitalism. Um, we have attention economy, we've got surveillance capitalism, we've got platform capitalism, we've got so many kinds of capitalisms and exploitative logics around us. And which emotions are eventually helpful to those exploitative logics is what counts, right? So, emotionality as a claim about a subject or a collective is clearly dependent on relations of power which endow others with meaning and value. In this book, I do not want to think about emotionality as a characteristic of bodies, whether individual or collective. In fact, I want to reflect on the processes whereby being emotional comes to be seen as a characteristic of some bodies and not others in the first place. Alrighty. Does this mean that does this mean in any way the prerogative of being emotional is more attributable to some bodies than others? Alright, I'll look into it later. In order to do this, we need to consider how emotions operate to make and shape bodies as forms of action. Okay, make and shape bodies as forms of action, which also involve orientations towards others. I think, right, I think the matter of orientation will come up later in the book Queer Phenomenology by Sarah Ahmed again. So, yeah, I think we could trace the thought of orientation. I mean, the development of Ahmed's relation to orientations from this book to that. Yeah, we could do that. Emotions for the British National Front may pose a danger to the national body of appearing soft, but the narrative itself is an emotional one. The reading of others as bogus is a reaction to the presence of others. Hardness is not the absence of emotion, but a different emotional orientation towards others. The hard white body is shaped by its reactions. The rage against others surfaces as a body that stands apart or keeps its distance from others. We shouldn't look for emotions in soft bodies. Emotions shape the very surfaces of bodies, which take shape through the repetition of actions over time, as well as through orientations towards and away from others. Indeed, attending to emotions might show us how all actions are reactions in the sense that what we do is shaped by the contact we have with others. In Spinoza's terms, emotions shape what bodies can do, as the modifications of the body by which the power of action on the body is increased or diminished. Right, so many philosophers of phenomenology are really making me, you know, are leaving me with no choice but to read Spinoza at this rate. Um We'll see. So rather than asking what are emotions, I will ask what do emotions do? In asking this question, I will not offer a singular theory of emotion or one account of the work that emotions do. Rather, I will track how emotions circulate between bodies, examining how they stick as well as move. In this introduction, my task will be to situate my account of the cultural politics of emotion with a very partial account of the history of thinking on emotions. All right. So I think this is the positionality statement before they actually start the book. Um, I will not offer a full review of this history, which would be an impossible task. It's important to indicate here that even if emotions have been subordinated to other faculties, they have still remained at the center of intellectual history. As a reader of this history, I have been overwhelmed by how much emotions have been a sticking point for philosophers. cultural theorists, psychologists, sociologists, as well as scholars from a range of other disciplines. This is not surprising. What is relegated to the margins is often, as we know from deconstruction, right at the center of thought itself. In the face of this history, my task is a modest one to show how my thinking has been informed by my contact with some work on emotions. All right. So, starting with the next subheading, which is emotions and objects. One way of reflecting on this history of thinking about emotion is to consider the debate about the relation between emotion, bodily sensation, and cognition. One could characterize a significant split in theories of emotion in terms of whether emotions are tied primarily to bodily sensations or to cognition. The former view is often ascribed to Descartes and David Hume. It would also be well represented by the work of William James, who has the following formulation. The bodily changes follow directly the perception of the exciting fact, and that our feeling of the same changes as they occur is the emotion. Emotion is the feeling of bodily change. The immediacy of the is suggests that emotions do not involve processes of thought, attribution, or evaluation. We feel fear, for example, because our heart is racing, our skin is sweating. A cognitivist view would be represented by Aristotle and by a number of thinkers who follow him. Okay, just a side note that I feel very uncomfortable when I'm reading authors which have been cited from like a century ago or like even like 50 years ago because their usage of the terms could mean something very different from how we're using those terms. So the fact that we've uh, quoted certain words here by Hume or let us say Aristotle, the terminology has to be kept in mind as to what exactly that particular author meant. Uh, Before we delve into any notion, any endeavor for defining how things stand today, so, such theorists suggest that emotions involve appraisals, judgments, attitudes, or a specific manner of apprehending the world, which are irreducible to bodily sensations. Some theorists have described emotions as being judgment, whilst others might point to how they involve judgment. The emotion of anger, for example, implies a judgment that something is bad, although we can be wrong in our judgment. Of course, many theorists suggest that emotions involve sensations or bodily feeling as well as forms of cognition. But as Alison M. Jagger has suggested, the shift towards a more cognitive approach has often been at the expense of an attention to bodily sensations. All right, so there's always this tug of war going on between the cognitive approach and studying bodily sensations themselves. Um, the split in attention towards these two. How else would we take on this project? You have to think about alternative ways of doing this, undertaking such a project, right? Involving both of them at the same time, giving due focus to both of them should be, I think, more considered than, just focusing on one or the other, or one at the expense of the other. Or when emotions are theorized as being about cognition as well as sensation, then these still tend to be presented as different aspects of emotion. All right, to begin a rethinking of the relation between bodily sensation, emotion, and judgment, we can turn to Descartes' The Passions of the Soul, whilst this little book may be full of problematic distinctions between mind and body, its observations on emotions are very suggestive. Right, so basically asking us to ignore all the mind body dualism of Descartes and focus on what he has to say about emotions. Right, so Descartes suggests that objects do not excite diverse passions because they are diverse, but because of the diverse ways in which they may harm or help us. So I'm seeing a utilitarian value attached to how he's looking at emotions. Again, trying to make emotions productive for us. That kind of a sense. This is an intriguing formulation. Some commentators have suggested that Descartes argues that emotions are reducible to sensations insofar as they are caused by objects, but Descartes offers a critique of the idea that objects have causal properties, suggesting that we don't have feelings for objects because of the nature of objects. Feelings instead take the shape of the contact we have with objects. I think this is a very important line because it's talking about orientation. Feelings take the shape of the contact we have with objects. So it's that point of contact, what's happening at the point of contact, that is crucial to the feeling taking shape. As he argues, we do not love and hate because objects are good or bad, but rather because they seem beneficial or harmful. Whether I perceive something as beneficial or harmful clearly depends upon how I am affected by something. This dependence opens up a gap in the determination of feeling. Whether something is beneficial or harmful involves thought and evaluation at the same time that it is felt by the body. So, I think we should stop assuming that emotions are just, completely exclusive from any thought process that's going on in your body because it's usually in the gap, I think, between what has happened and how you're going to perceive it, between that gap that a lot of thought takes place that actually shapes how you come into contact with a certain thing, how you perceive that certain thing, how you get to feel about that certain thing, how you orient yourself towards a certain thing, and how that thing turns towards you a certain way. The process of attributing an object as being or not being beneficial or harmful, which may become translated into good or bad, clearly involves reading the contact we have with objects in a certain way. As I argue in chapter 1, whether something feels good or bad already involves a process of reading in the very attribution of significance. Contact involves the subject as well as histories that come before the subject. All right. I think this is important as well. Histories that come before the subject, so not all of it is available to you, but it is still there around you. If emotions are shaped by contact with objects rather than being caused by objects, then emotions are not simply in the subject or the object. This does not mean that emotions are not read as being resident in subjects or objects. I will show how sub objects are often read as the cause of emotions in the very process of taking an orientation towards them. So, if the contact with an object generates feeling, then emotion and sensation cannot be easily separated. All right. So there is this gap between, I think, emotion and sensation, even though they have been considered almost, synonymous. So a common way of describing, I don't know if I'm right about this, by the way, but still, we'll see. A common way of describing the relation between them is as a form of company, right? So you're saying they're keeping each other company. Okay. Pleasure and pain become companions of love and hate. For example, in Aristotle's formulation, the idea of companions does not do the trick, precisely given the implication that sensation and emotion can part company. Instead, I want to suggest that the distinction between sensation and emotion can only be analytic and, as such, is premised on the reification of a concept. We can reflect on the word impression used by David Hume in his work on emotion. To form an impression might involve acts of perception and cognition as well as an emotion. All right, so there are three things I think we have to be careful of here. Terminologies coming in: impression, perception, cognition, and emotion. All four of them are different, but impression can involve these three, but they're slightly different from each other and slightly shaping each other, is what I mean, right? Um, But forming an impression also depends on how objects impress upon us. An impression can be an effect on the subject's feeling. She made an impression. It can be a belief to be under an impression. It can be an imitation or an image to create an impression, or it can be a mark on the surface to leave an impression. We need to remember the press in an impression, right? So there are these different meanings of impression. And I just love it when scholars do this. They take a word and just throw it in all these different directions and see which one lands for you, right? Because all of them have resonated with us at some point or the other. Right. It allows us to associate the experience of having an emotion with the very affect of one surface upon another, an affect that leaves its mark or trace. So not only do I have an impression of others, but they also leave me with an impression. They impress me and impress upon me. I will use the idea of impression as it allows me to avoid making analytical distinctions between bodily sensation, emotion, and thought as if they could be experienced as distinct realms of human experience. I think this is very important, that making these clear cut analytical distinctions between what's going on around emotion or even affect for that matter, because I think it was in another interview later that Sarah said um, what was it, that making this distinction between affect and emotion is not something she participates in, is not a practice that she participates in, because yeah, the definitions have certain common elements in them, right? At least what is the major factoring into the definition has a lot of commonalities. So, yeah, but this what is happening around, and emotion is still like it has been at the center of intellectual projects all over, since ancient times, but it is still so under theorized in the sense that the pathologization or even the manipulation of emotion that goes on in academia gets largely, ignored. That is what we have to study more of, at least. So yeah, clearly defining something right now, such as emotion and the difference between emotion, sensation, thought, or affect, all of these things is not possible. And I'm not even sure if it is possible even in the future, because they are not distinct realms of human experience, like Sarah said here. And I think it is still valid today, right? This still holds true for research methodology. I could use this, or I don't know. So, how do we form such impressions? Rethinking the place of the object of feeling will allow us to reconsider the relation between sensation and emotion within phenomenology, the turn away from what Elizabeth V. Spellman calls the dumb view of emotions has involved an emphasis on intentionality. I haven't read Spellman, so I can't say. Emotions are intentional in the sense that they're about something, they involve a direction or orientation towards an object. The aboutness of emotions means they involve a stance on the world or a way of apprehending the world. Now, I want to bring this model of the object as aboutness into dialogue with the model of contact implicit in Descartes. Emotions are both about objects, which they hence shape, and are also shaped by contact with objects. Neither of these ways of approaching an object presumes that the object has a material existence. Objects in which I'm involved can also be imagined. All right, this is very crucial for, let us say, fandom studies, because the object of fanish, let us say, practices is a fantasy. Even if it happens to be an anime character, even if it happens to be a real life person, a celebrity, the real fanish, let us say, attachment is to an object of fantasy, or at least you are projecting or reading an aspirational reading into a certain entity, and that is largely in the domain of fantasy. So it can also be imagined, an object that is imagined here, as Sarah said. I don't know, but I'll have to look into this further if I can use it this way or not. But so far, this is how I'm reading it, and yeah, because yeah, a large part of how we do any sort of aspirational reading has to do with a lot of fantasy work. So you have to get into fantasy scholarship if you want to use it this way. For example, I can have a memory of something, and that memory might trigger a feeling. The memory can be the object of my feeling in both senses. The feeling is shaped by contact with the memory and also involves an orientation towards what is remembered. So I might feel pain when I remember this or that, and in remembering this or that, I might attribute what is remembered as being painful. Let's use another example. The example that is often used in the psychological literature on emotions is a child and a bear. The child sees the bear and is afraid. The child runs away. Now, the dumb view would be that the bear makes the child afraid and that the bodily symptoms of fear are automatic: pulse rate, sweating, and so on. So, functionalist models of emotion, which draw on evolutionary theory, might say that the fear has a function to protect the child from danger to allow survival. Fear in this situation could be an instinctual reaction that has enhanced successful adaptation and thus selection. Fear would also be an action. Fear would even be about what it leads the child to do. But the story, even in its bare bones, is not so simple. Why is the child afraid of the bear? The child must already know the bear is fearsome. This decision is not necessarily made by her, and it might not even be dependent on past experiences. This could be a first time encounter, and the child still runs for it. But what is she running from? What does she see when she sees the bear? We have an image of the bear as an animal to be feared, as an image that is shaped by cultural histories and memories. When we encounter the bear, we already have an impression of the risks of the encounter, as an impression that is felt on the surface of the skin. This knowledge is bodily. Certainly, the child might not need time to think before she runs for it, but the immediacy of the reaction is not itself a sign of a lack of mediation. It is not that the bear is fearsome on its own, as it were. It is fearsome to someone or somebody. So fear is not in the child, let alone in the bear, but is a matter of how child and bear come into contact. This contact is shaped by past histories of contact unavailable in the present, which allow the bear to be apprehended as fearsome. The story does not, despite this, inevitably lead to the same ending. Another child, another bear, and we might even have another story. Right. It is not just that we might have an impression of bears, but this bear also makes an impression and leaves an impression. Fear shapes the surfaces of bodies in relation to objects. Emotions are relational, they involve reactions or relations of towardness or awareness in relation to such objects. The bear becomes the object in both senses. We have a contact with an object and an orientation towards that object. To be more specific, the aboutness of fear involves a reading of contact. The child reads the contact as dangerous, which involves apprehending the bear as fearsome. We can note also that the reading then identifies the bear as the cause of the feeling. The child becomes fearful and the bear becomes fearsome. The attribution of feeling to an object, I feel afraid because you're fearsome, is an effect of the encounter which moves the subject away from the object. Emotions involve such affective forms of reorientation. I think this is important to acknowledge that, yeah, that like emotions involve affective forms of reorientation, but emotions also involve that reading of contact. Of course, if we change the bear to a horse, we might even get to the father. If the that is a joke, I think. To okay, joke relating to Freud, as I saw in the footnotes. What is this thing? In the notes section. If the object of feeling both shapes and is shaped by emotions, then the object of feeling is never simply before the subject. How the object impresses upon us may depend on histories that remain alive insofar as they have already left their impressions. The object may stand in for other objects or may be proximate to other objects. Feelings may stick to some objects and slide over others. In this book, I offer an analysis of affective economies where feelings do not reside in subjects or objects but are produced as effects of circulation. The circulation of objects allows us to think about the sociality of emotion. I'll be looking forward to this part where it talks about affective economy and circulation of, let us say, a sociality of emotion. That is going to be great. All right, inside out and outside in. This is another subtopic, subheading. Um, at least I think this is, yeah. What do I mean